So I said last time that Deuteronomy is the farewell speech of Moses, 30 chapters long, culminating in this beautiful passage in Deuteronomy 29 and 30. It's as beautiful as any prose in the Bible. And there are certain problems in Deuteronomy that I'll note for now. Remember in the book of Numbers, there was a rebellion against Moses and Aaron by a man named Korach, who it turns out is Moses and Aaron's first cousin when you look at the who begat whom lists. And he challenges them for authority and ends up with 250 followers all getting burned up. And he's also challenged there. Moses is challenged by these two men, Dathan, Edward G. Robinson, and Abiram, who they and their whole families end up going down in an earthquake. So the rebellion of Korach, Dathan, and Abiram is a big scene in the book of Numbers. In Deuteronomy, when Moses refers back to it, he mentions Dathan and Abiram, but he doesn't include Korach. Why would he leave him out? Lecture 19. Also in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is giving this review of all his years of history with the people, and Aaron is only mentioned twice by him. I mean, it is big brother, you know, and recently there was, in an excavation, they found a petrified piece of wood that said, Aaron, Mom always liked you better, Moses. But that, even with that discovery, which was a major, I think I sense some doubters out there. It's very strange. Aaron is mentioned only twice, once to say he died and once to say he made the golden calf. I mean, couldn't there be something more or nicer about someone who's taken up almost as much attention as Moses for the books preceding that? Lecture 19. I mentioned last time Moses repeats the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy 5. They'd already appeared in Exodus 20, but there are some differences. Lecture 19. And then it goes into the narrative finally in the last few chapters of Deuteronomy after Moses has finished his speech. In Deuteronomy 31, it says Moses writes a book. The word that's usually translated book there can't mean what we mean by a book. This is a codex, a book that has a spine and pages that you can turn. It was one of the revolutionary inventions of all time. You know, so you could, reading the Bible, somebody could say, well, look at Hosea, and you could find Hosea, you know, and somebody say, well, what about back in Genesis? And you go back and go to Genesis. But they had to write on scrolls. And scrolls can get very big and long. I mean, it is impossible to have the entire Bible on a scroll. You can have the entire 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books on a scroll, and you do. Most any synagogue into which you'd walk will have inside a Torah scroll that has the whole first 5 books. And that's pretty unwieldy. So this was a great invention. So when it says book, presumably they mean scroll. So Moses writes on this scroll in Deuteronomy 31. It says all this teaching, this Torah that God has given him. And he gives it to the Levites. And Moses says to the Levites, take this scroll of the Torah, the scroll of instruction, and place it by the ark, and it will be a witness there against you. That is to say, there is a written document that includes all those laws and that includes a list of all those blessings that they get if they do it, all the curses that will happen to them if they don't do it. And it's there, he says, as a witness. So somebody 500 or 1,000 years later can't say, we didn't know. Now remember that scroll. It won't go away. It will come up again sometime later in the story. And you don't have to wait till lecture 19. It's a couple before that. And then in Deuteronomy 32, Moses gives them a song. He sings this song to them that's written out. And I don't know how good 120-year-old guys are at singing. I mean, I'm bad now, you know. But he gives them a song. And he says, the song will be a witness against you in the future. So that's like, you know, if we all had a song, that, you know, about, I don't know how to do this, I can like currently political or religious or something, you know, saying such and such would happen, you wouldn't be able to say, I didn't know. And songs are much easier to memorize than you know, just recited prose. So when he gives them the song, you should note that that's going to come up later too. Most notably, in the words of Deuteronomy 32, there's a passage where God says, this is a bad generation. I will hide my face from them. I will see what their future will be. The older translations take that line as, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. And that's okay as long as you understand the word end there not to mean end. It means what will happen down the line in the long run. Remember that. And Moses uses that same term when he's talking to the people. He says, I know that someday you're gonna go wrong, and in that day God will hide his face from you. Now we already know that the face of God is hidden anyway in the Bible. So this is an expression. It occurs 32 times in the Hebrew Bible, the expression, the hiding of the face of God. And in a sense, it's the ultimate punishment. It's not just, in a way, it's worse than if God does something bad to you as a punishment. It's abandonment. For a little kid, for a dog, the worst thing you can do is go away and just leave them. And cats don't care. Dogs care about this. You see that thing? A page from a dog's diary. Went out today and played, came back, gave me food. Wow, yeah. Went out, threw a stick. Yeah, great. Then came back in. Yeah, gave me food. Okay, then I went out, I laid down. Yeah, then I came back and gave me food. And then there's a page from a cat's diary. It is the 6th year of my captivity. They continue to taunt me with those pieces of string. The other day I killed a bird and brought it and dropped it by their front door to show them what I'm capable of. You can leave a cat for the weekend and they'll just be mad at you and let you know that. A dog, you'll break his heart when you leave him for the weekend. Children also. That it's one thing to spank a kid, which we don't do anymore. We don't do that anymore. But it is another thing to abandon your kid and not be available when they need you. And so this hiding of the face is a serious penalty. And indeed, in the Aramaic translation of the Bible, which was done, you know, centuries after the Hebrew Bible was finished, they translated into Aramaic. And there, wherever it says hiding of the face in the Hebrew, they changed it to takes away his presence in the Aramaic. That is, the Aramaic translator was trying to convey what it meant, not the literal of it. So note that song of Moses, and then he gives him another song in Deuteronomy 33 called The Blessing of Moses, and it's interesting in parallel to Jacob's last words, the blessing of Jacob back in Genesis 49 on his deathbed, because there he gives what it is he wishes for each of his 12 sons. Here it's for each of the 12 tribes who are descended from those 12 sons, and that's what each one may stand for. And then Moses goes up to the top of this mountain, and he looks out where he's able to see the land but never go there. So the greatest Israelite of all time never sets foot in Israel. He can see it but not participate in it. And he gets to see the whole thing, how beautiful it is, which it is. I mean, I've been there. It is beautiful. And then there's this passage in Deuteronomy 34, the last chapter, where it tells what happens. It says Moses dies there, it says literally by the mouth of God, by the word of God. There was a midrashic tradition that meant, because it mentions mouth, that it means not the word of God, but the kiss of God, the most perfect death. You can't tell. The interesting thing, though, is the next word. It says, and he buried him. Who buried him? The only other one around is God. So it's always been understood that God personally buries Moses. And it says no one knows the location of his gravesite to this day. So there was never like a pilgrimage place to the grave of Moses. There was no ancestor veneration or ancestor worship of Moses. Moses as a figure is gone. The body is gone. Now this, you?
Did they do that with Aaron?
No, Aaron, no such notation. Though nobody knows where Aaron's grave is either, because it's out in Moab someplace. But they don't make the special note of it. You're supposed to be aware of that we don't know where Moses is buried. And we're going to come to something about that. You notice we've gone through 5 books of the Bible so far, and we've hardly mentioned any question about beliefs in life after death and what they thought happens to you after you die. So there's not much about it. But later, as we study later periods of the biblical world, the question of life after death will come up, and the question of what they thought happens to you after you die. But and it will involve ancestor veneration, and any of you who are anthropology types know in ancestor veneration, the location of the grave is crucial. You don't just pray to the soul of your great-grandma to look out for your family, or you go to her grave and you bring food and water there, and that's what they did. But not at this point, and never at the grave of Moses. It's an unknown to the Israelites. The strange thing is, the Hebrew text there says, and he buried him. And so one assumes it's God. Now the interesting thing is, I've told you that there are other texts besides our Hebrew Bible texts. And this is called textual criticism, and it's one of the things you master in this business. And if you look at the Greek text of the Hebrew Bible, it has a different word there. It doesn't say, and he buried him. And you say, but who cares what the Greek says? The original is in the Hebrew. But when you live in a town named Athens, you kind of have to care what the Greek says, especially when you defeat Troy. Coincidence? I think not. And so the reason we all learn Greek is you have to be able to read the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, because it's not a translation of this Hebrew. It's a translation of another older Hebrew manuscript than this that is now lost. So you have to read the Greek, figure out what Hebrew is behind that, and compare that to the Hebrew here. All right? And as it happens, in the Greek text it says, and they buried him. Now, one would read that and naturally conclude then Moses went up, he's with God up on the mountain, he sees the land, he dies, and the people bury him. So what are you going to do? The difference between and he buried him in Hebrew and they buried him is one letter, not just, it's not even a different word, it's just one extra letter that makes it a plural at the end. So which scribe got it right and which scribe got it wrong? I've been doing this a long time. One way you do it is you look for a third witness to the text. And we've got a third witness to the text thanks to this goat in 1947 who discovers the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible that are 1,000 years older than the manuscript we use to get our usual Bibles. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says, and they buried him, the same as the Greek. So that gives you 2 out of 3, and as you all know, truth is determined in this world by democratic vote. As you know, in this world, truth is not determined by democratic vote. All I know is that it's 2 out of 3, but that doesn't make the 2 right and the 1 wrong. We don't know which scribe changed what when. So as I say, I've been doing this a long time, and a lot of it is trying to figure out where the change took place, and was it on purpose or because a scribe slipped and left out a letter. You've all done that, where you write a first draft of a paper and then you realize in the second draft or wherever that you missed something, that even your spell check missed something because you wanted to say to break something and you wrote B-R-A-K-E, and since that's also really a word, the spell check completely misses it. So, this really happens. And in this case, I can tell you, as much as I've thought about this, I really can't decide which is the original text. And I'm really glad that I can't figure it out. And I kind of hope none of you figures it out either. Yeah, you figured it out?
Well, I just wanted to ask if it was possible that maybe it was the same issue that at the beginning of Genesis where it says, "Let us."
Ah, that's very interesting. At the beginning of Genesis, right, God says, "Let us create humans in our image." And then in the Garden of Eden, God says, also in the plural. And then at the Tower of Babel, God says, "Let us go down." Now, the interesting thing that most people don't note about that plural stuff is the 3 examples I just gave you are the only 3 examples in the Bible. So God speaking the plural for some reason only happens at the beginning of time, right? Prior to Abraham. So it would be a strange thing if now it's a plural suddenly coming up again. Now you could say, no, it's like bookending the 5 books of Moses. God, plural at the beginning, plural at the end. So, we could roll with this. You'd want to be careful, though, because at the first, it's somebody speaking in the plural. At the end, it's talking about an unnamed someone in the plural. So you could say, well, maybe that's God, and the God who spoke in the plural 5 books ago, but I just caution you, we're on very speculative ground here. Yeah.
Don't you also have that weird Abraham encounter where there's like 3 people, but he's talking to God, but some of the people leave, but...
Yes, but the 3, right, the 3 are angels. I mean, it's explicit that at least 2 of them are. And I mean, the explanation I gave of angels at that time is angels are just sort of zaps of God in your face that look like people. So all of these are possible, but as long as we understand we're speculating there. It's a jump when it just says, "and they buried him," for us to say, well, that's God because God spoke in the plural back at the beginning, or that's angels because we had angels coming in groups on one occasion in Genesis 18. They're possible, but understand that we're working to get there. I understand perfectly if a very religious Christian at the conservative end of the Christian spectrum says, well, it's the Trinity. It's a foreshadowing of the Trinity, and so it's a plural, which is a reading that I, as a Hebrew Bible scholar can't imagine. But I understand why someone else might. So I understand all of these possibilities, but every one of them involve our bringing in some other thought or belief or something we had about it. If somebody were just reading this story and hadn't, done anything but just read the text, and they buried him, so you go, he's been with the people all this time. If anybody, you say, so-and-so died in Athens, and they buried him at the funeral. We'd all just understand the word "they" to be just a generic reference to, all those involved in doing it. So the rule I think I've told you from my great teacher, Professor Cross, was the most banal reading of the text is usually the correct one. So all the ones where we shoot off into more interesting readings are great, but usually it's the uninteresting reading because people tend to just, be factual. Now that's not a proof, that's just another perspective to throw in. What I like about the fact that we don't really know the answer to this one is you can't tell on any of these then if Moses ends his life with God or with the people. He's lived his whole life in this interim zone that the prophet lives, and he, as the ultimate prophet, lives halfway between God and humans. And you've seen it. Whenever he's talking to humans, they treat him like he's the one responsible, and he says, no, it's not me, it's God. They see him from the divine realm. And whenever he talks to God, he's like defending the humans. We saw that scene on Mount Sinai where God says, look what your people have done down there. And he says to God, oh, no, forgive your people. And it goes back and forth. And he says to God, don't get angry. They've made a golden calf. Okay, you can forgive them. They're your children. Covenant with Abraham. And God says, okay, all right, Moses, I forgive them. And Moses goes down, and he's angry, and he smashes the tablets, and he has people massacre people. So whenever he talks to God, he represents humans. Whenever he talks to humans, he represents God. So to me, it is perfect that you cannot tell if Moses ends his life in the presence of God or in the presence of human beings whom he loved. I think he loved both. And I just think that's a great finish. And if any of you is ever a high school teacher and somebody says this and you circle their paper and write ambiguous, well, give it up. And then just note also that text that says no other prophet arose like him. And that brings to the end these first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These go by several names. One is the 5 books of Moses. Now that's very strange, since Moses isn't even born yet till the second one. So we call it the 5 books of Moses, even though, he didn't even come up in Genesis. So that's been taken by tradition to mean that Moses is the author of these first 5 books. So you note it never says anywhere that he's the author of the first 5 books. At the end, in Deuteronomy 31, it says he writes all these words on a scroll of the Torah, but you can't tell how much is on that. Is that just the Deuteronomic law? Is it just the last law he gave? Is it more law? Is it also all the stories? Are you supposed to understand from Genesis 1:1 to Deuteronomy 34:12? That's all by him. So that's one of the names, though. It's called 5 books of Moses. The second is it's called the, what would I do without Tyler here singing? Second is called the Pentateuch. Penta in Greek, 5. Teochos means scroll. So the 5 scrolls. And the other name, which is arguably the most confusing, is the Torah, coming from a Hebrew root meaning to teach or to shoot. Really. And we've seen because the word Torah can incorporate law, so sometimes in your English Bibles it will always translate the word Torah as law. It does have the same root as the word normally meaning to teach, so some people translate Torah as teaching. I like the word instruction because the word instruction captures both the idea of teaching and the idea of law. I give you instructions, that's like law. I instruct you, that's like teaching. So it comes the closest. More and more, though, since the word Torah occurs in English dictionaries now, so probably when you translate the Bible into English, where it says Torah in the Hebrew, you should just write Torah in the English and be done with it. But understand then that sometimes there are small passages of law that are called Torah in it, and then it gets this, the Torah, thus, which refers to the whole 5 books of Moses. So today, that's how most people would take it. But you can use any one of those 5 and any of those 3 terms in this course, and I'll know what you're talking about. Now, we are at the end. Yeah.
Sorry, was there any, in the ancient world, was there a distinction with Torah and the supposed 613 commandments versus the 5 books as a whole?
There's certainly no distinction like that within the biblical world, because it's you'll see way down near the end of the biblical world that anybody starts to think of the 5 books of Moses, a scroll with all the law on it. And by the time they do that, it would have not only all the laws on the text, but would have all the stories in there too. So in the broadest sense, the word Torah does not ever mean just the 613 commandments. It means the whole, in the beginning God created heavens and earth. Is that answering your question? There are a few laws I wanted to recapture. We talked about the tabernacle and sacrifice, about the foods. few famous ones. Nobody asked me about the law, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for life, burn for burn, etc. And that occurs a couple of times in the text. Some people use that to show what a violent, primitive book the Bible is, how harsh its penalties are. If you look at the first case of it, it's in Exodus 21. You may recall this law. Remember there was a law code from Exodus 21 to 23 that's called the Covenant Code. It's the first of these several law codes, because then in Leviticus and Numbers you had the priestly law code, and now in Deuteronomy we have what's called the Deuteronomic law code. So you've got three main law codes: Covenant Code in Exodus, the priestly law code in some of Exodus, all of Leviticus, part of Numbers, and then the Deuteronomic law code, which is conveniently located in a book called Deuteronomy, so it's real easy to remember that it's the Deuteronomic law code. In the Covenant law code in Exodus 21, starting at 23rd, verse 23, well, I want to back up and start a little in verse 22, the verse before. If people will fight and they hurt a pregnant woman, so two guys are fighting and they bump into a pregnant woman or knock her over or whatever, and her children go out, which would mean either she goes into labor and has the baby, or maybe it means they cause a miscarriage. But there won't be damage or injury. He, whoever is at fault, will definitely be punished, whatever the husband of the woman and the judges impose on him. But if there will be an injury or damage, in the King James Bible it says mischief, if there will be any mischief, but they used the word differently then you will set life in place of life, eye in place of eye, tooth in place of tooth, right? Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, injury for injury, sore or wound for wound, all these different words for a different injury. Now, what does that mean? That if she gives birth to an infant and it's a miscarriage and it dies, then you kill the person who caused it? Or is it, some say the distinction is, in the first case, it's the woman gives birth, it's a miscarriage or whatever anyway, but in the second case, it's if there's any damage to the woman, that it's not just to the fetus or baby, but to the woman herself, then it goes into this life for life, tooth, you know. It's usually understood, though, to refer to the infant. And then you go, is this meant literally, eye for eye, tooth for tooth? Wait a minute, babies don't have teeth. So we know it's not meant literally. And when you look at the case where this comes up again in the priestly law code, it's in Leviticus 24, it adds different ones, this eye for eye, tooth for tooth, burn for burn, and there it's in a story where nobody got burned. So it is usually understood by biblical interpreters, I think correctly, that the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing doesn't mean how harsh they were. It's precisely the opposite. It means punishment has to suit the crime. Whatever punishments, whatever you do in any period, you can do eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life, but you can't do eye for life. You can't do a tooth for an eye. It's just a general principle. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you're found guilty of gouging somebody's eye out, that they hold you down in the courtroom and they gouge your eye out. On the other hand, it's possible that it did mean it literally. So I never rule out, I'm willing to admit it's possible, but the likely reading, and the way we know it's been understood since the earliest post-biblical days, was that it meant a principle of justice, that punishment has to suit the crime and cannot go beyond the crime. I hope that's what it meant. Some people, by the way, have related that case of the two guys fighting and causing the woman to go into labor to arguments today about abortion. I would warn you to be very cautious on either side, whatever your views are of abortion. I'm not sure you should be too secure using this law as a proof. Since it's not clear if it's the woman or the infant, it's not clear if it's a miscarriage or just a premature birth that does or doesn't have injury, since you're not sure what the eye for eye, tooth for tooth about it is. It has so many uncertainties in the meaning of this law that something that's as significant to a lot of people as their opinion about abortion, you don't want to be too quick to draw your conclusion from this. And I'm sorry, because every time there's a passage in the Bible about homosexuality, abortion, or anything that's a big issue today, execution, I go, well, wait, you got to be careful with the text. But what can I do? You should always be careful with the text. You've seen that. It often doesn't mean what you thought. And if it's on one of the things that's one of the hot issues of your day, then I don't try to get anybody to take any side on these. I just want everybody to be very cautious and read the evidence carefully before you reach whatever conclusion you're going to reach. Yeah.
I meant to ask this in Leviticus, I don't know why I haven't, but I think it's Leviticus 22, when it's talking about peo. It's saying, in the text it says, do not cut the corners of your hair or your beard, and do not tattoo yourself. Is it referring to when you're in mourning, or is it a general statement?
Yeah, these passages in Leviticus. One says, yeah, you don't cut the corners of your head, trim it, which is why sometimes you'll see, today it's only done among Hasidic or extremely, at the very far conservative end of the Orthodox spectrum. Jewish men will wear, like, you'll see that they have like curls here, and they let it grow their whole lives, and they don't cut that because of that verse. And you already hinted at, the point that in the context of that, it isn't entirely clear, but it seems to appear to be things like that include where it says you shouldn't cut yourself are mourning practices. That just means you shouldn't do that because maybe people did do that sort of thing as part of mourning for someone who had died. And they warn about that. You also mentioned the tattoo one. This is a great opportunity for me to say I was wrong about something. In my own translation and commentary on that passage in Leviticus, I understood that to mean, as people pretty much always have, you're not supposed to have tattoos. And every now and then I'll get an email from a student. Sometimes it's one I know and sometimes it's not. And they'll give me some phrase and they'll say, like, God is with me. How would you write that out in Hebrew? And I go, okay, I know why they're asking this question. And a cousin of mine, who's actually getting quite well known as a very funky artist in Florida, he wrote to me and he said, could you write out this long sentence in Hebrew for me? Could you write that out in Hebrew for me? And I'm going, okay, I know why he's asking me that. And sure enough, I saw him a few weeks ago, and there it was, right there. Wait, right to left, right there. And he did do it right, And I did translate it as tattoo, and I did write in my commentary, Jews are not allowed to have tattoos. Anybody who follows that rule of the Bible can't have a tattoo. And that didn't matter that much until, the recent 10, 20 years, tattoos have become a big thing. I keep looking over at you, I'm sorry, but tattoos are a big thing. My daughter has a tattoo, and I said, why do we translate that word tattoo in that passage in Leviticus? And I can't think of any reason at all, except that people always have. The Hebrew is a ketovet, which would mean an inscription, something written. And the second word describing it is kaka. I don't think that means what it means in English. You can't write a ketovet kaka, an inscription of kaka, in your body. So first of all, it's not clear if that only refers to as a mourning practice. Secondly, even if it does mean in general life, not just when you're mourning somebody, we don't know what a ketovet kaka is. A ketovet meaning inscription, it might mean only applying to words, not to pictures. It might mean an inscription that you actually cut, like with a knife, into your body. Like I had a friend who His girlfriend was Louise, and he took a knife and he carved Louise in his chest. Yeah. I never found out if they ended up I mean, they were just in high school, you know. I don't know if those go away more easily than tattoos. Yeah.
Isn't there a later story of one of the prophets, I think it's Elijah, with it's him and then the prophets of Israel, and they're cutting themselves, all those different things to get their God to listen to them, and maybe it's a warning against not to do the practices these other peoples do to communicate with their God. Is that a possible part of it?
Yes. I mean, I can't deny that. The passage he's talking about we're going to come to when we read the book of 1 Kings, and it takes place at Mount Carmel, what is presently the city of Haifa in Israel. And there's this duel between Elijah and the hundreds of prophets of Baal, and to who can get their God to produce lightning or fire to make the sacrifice work. And the priests of Baal are praying to Baal, and nothing's happening. So they do, as you said, they start cutting themselves to show how fervent they are. And I mean, they're not doing it as a mourning practice. It's in a way the opposite. They're trying to get their God's favor by showing how, you know, I would cut myself for you. And it's entirely likely that that's related to this, that it would be not only as a mourning practice, but, you know, just cutting yourself up is a really bad idea. And therefore, I honestly don't think tattoos are forbidden by the Bible, so any of you have been wondering about that, you're cool, it's all right, by me. And I actually, if any of you have ever bought my commentary on the Torah, you have my permission. You cross out the word tattoo there, and or put in footnote, and author now says uncertain, you know. And I am actually going to put electronically. I'll put up online the many things where I've realized I was wrong when I did that commentary. But you know, we grow, we learn. You can admit you were wrong. So I'm not positive. It could mean tattoos. But I see no reason or evidence to think it means tattoos. So I don't see on what grounds anybody could forbid you to have a tattoo biblically. Yeah.
So that's the only place in the Tanakh that.
That's the one place, the Ketovet Kaka. So don't go writing with any kaka on your. There's the law of the Jubilee. I want to emphasize. I told you that there are laws in the Torah that are anti-feudal, like the law that prevents the king from having a lot of horses and a lot of silver and gold, because they're trying in many ways to keep all the wealth from being at the top. Now, the law of the Jubilee is this law that it's in Leviticus 25. And what you see at the end of our story in Deuteronomy, it says Moses charges Joshua, his successor, to divide up the land among the tribes when they all arrive in the new land. And we'll turn to Joshua soon, and we'll see that that's what Joshua does. So you figure every tribe gets some territory. You can look on maps of ancient Israel, and it shows you where all the tribes are. And then within each tribe, each clan of that tribe gets some territory. And then within each clan, each family gets a territory. And then within each family, the various members, meaning the males in the family, get territory. Now, what happens when you're a guy and you own your land, your farm, or whatever, your piece of land in the city, and you die? Answer, it goes to your sons. What if you don't have any sons? That's the case when it can go to daughters. But it stays in the family. In biblical law, land is unalienable. That means if you get your land and it doesn't have any river or stream in it, but the guy next to you does have a babbling brook year-round, so he always has water, you don't. And in a year of drought, where there's very little water, he might survive. You won't. So you borrow from him in the year of drought to survive. But let's say the next couple of years are bad years too. I know this could never happen where a whole country could have a bad economic situation and a lot of people lose their land, but let's just say theoretically. So you and maybe others, you lose your land because you had to borrow from the guy who was wealthier or had, you know, a better position than you, and now you can't pay it back. So he forecloses on your mortgage, and he takes your land. Well, now what do you do for a living to survive? You end up as a serf, an employee, working on the land that you used to own. Now, I just gave you the most simplistic economic explanation of feudalism you'll ever hear. But I do it just to capture what normally happens in the flow of things. Wealth moves to the top, and especially in terms of property, some come to own more and more of the property. You saw the story in Genesis where, remember, there's 7 years of famine, and the result of it is that the Pharaoh ends up owning all of the land of Egypt, and everybody now works for the Pharaoh. So they didn't want that to happen in biblical law. So there's this law you see in Leviticus that says every 50 years, the whole system stops and starts over. And the word for that in Hebrew comes into English. Jubilee is one of those words in English that comes from the Hebrew Yovel, which is pronounced in English Jubilee, which is, if the worst thing happens and you lose your land, every 50th year, the whole economic system of the country starts over again. So you get your land back. So if you were unlucky enough to lose it in the first year, the worst that can happen to you is 48 bad years. And then you get your land back. If you're dead, your son gets it. If he's dead, your grandson gets it. But land is unalienable. It stays in a family forever. And you know, owning property means a lot to people. People tell us the American ideal is to own a home, and we're living in an age where that ideal is being challenged. If you've traveled in Europe, in Israel, most countries of the world, people, the majority of the population do not own a house. They live in apartments or other sorts of residence, but not residences. But owning land is this amazing feeling of both tremendous responsibility. You know, Dave Barry wrote that book called Homes and Other Black Holes. I mean, when you own land and a house, everything, you're just, for the rest of your life, you're fixing toilets and floods and electric and so on. But it's also this tremendous thing that you own a piece of it. And the idea in Israelite law was like an economic democracy. Everybody gets something that belongs to their family forever. And it can never be taken away for more than 49 years. And then you just get it back. If you owe anybody any money on it, too bad. He has to just give it back to you anyway. Did they really do this in biblical times? Did the system work? I have no idea. But they tried. It's at least the law is on the books. Slaves. They treated their slaves better. Biblical law, on the one hand, does not do away with slavery. It was part of that world. But it says you can't mistreat a slave. If your slave is a fellow Israelite, you can't keep him or her for more than 6 years. If at the end of the 6 years, your slave says, I want to be a slave. I don't want to be free. I don't want to leave. I like things just the way they are. Then you do this weird ceremony where you punch a hole through his ear, and that's symbolic that now he's yours. He chose to be a slave forever. But they seem by that to be discouraging that. A foreigner who's captured in war or something and is a slave, or who's bought, you can keep a slave forever, but even then, you can't mistreat a slave. The point about Egypt, it never criticized the Egyptians just for having slaves. They didn't think it was wrong to have slavery. The Egyptians are criticized for the harshness of their slavery of the Israelites. Whereas the law biblically is, if you injure a slave, the slave goes free. And it says, if you hit your slave and he loses an eye as a result, slave goes free. If you hit your slave and the slave loses a tooth as a result, the slave goes free. Now get that, because for 39 years been teaching this, and someone always, on an exam, when I say, what's the punishment? What happens to you if you knock out your slave's tooth? Or if you knock out your slave's eye, and someone always puts an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. They do that to you. That's not right. The slave goes free is what happened, and that might be more evidence that that expression, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, was a symbolic or metaphoric thing, because here too they're using those as examples. You knock out his eye, he goes free. You knock out his tooth, it goes free. It doesn't mention if you cut off his finger, he goes free, but almost certainly it would have included that too. So it's giving a legal principle. So that, and the principle is, okay, we're still allowing slavery in the world, but you don't own the slave's body. The slave is not your property in the same way that your house or your horse are. And what that did is it didn't end slavery, it started chipping away at it. Once you have a world where slaves have rights, you're on the slope that led, which unfortunately took another several thousands of years to do away with slavery. In our age, I understand, I'm not naive about this, I understand there is still slavery in this world, but in our world, you have to lie about it. You have to say, no, those little kids like making Nikes all day. That wasn't fair. I don't know anybody at Nike. But that when you oppress people, you have to say, oh no, those women like having to be prostitutes since they were 11 years old, and at least the world has accepted that slavery is obscene. And that's a step to. And when you then start saying slaves have rights, that's the beginning of that slope. So the Bible on slavery is very similar to what I said last time about the Bible in terms of women. You can pick out all the bad passages, and you can pick out all the good passages, but what really is the Bible was a particular step on the slope of eventually banishing slavery, which is one of the 3 worst things in the world from the planet. I picked 3, and war is first. I'm pretty sure of that. So those are laws. Any I missed? Any law you read you want to ask about which you wanted to ask? You can feel free for the rest of the course to come back to those. There will be questions about law in your midterm. What's the law of such and such? Yeah.
I just want to ask, because I've always wondered this, the process of the changing of the borders of the Promised Land from Abraham to when the Israelites actually go into Canaan. Why does it change from the Euphrates to the Nile from the sea to the Jordan to the Negev? What is?
Oh, what is the boundaries of the land? It's a little tricky, right? It said, I will give this land to your descendants, says Abram, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Now, we do and don't know where that means, right? So here's the Nile, Red Sea, Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River. Then far over here in what is today Iraq is the Euphrates River, which merges with the Tigris River, and they both empty into the Persian Gulf. So when he says to Abraham, I'm going to give this land to you from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates, that would appear to mean everything from here to here is going to belong to Abraham's descendants, which means half of Egypt will belong to them. And nearly all biblical scholars have always said then that the river of Egypt does not mean the Nile. It's never called the Nile. It's called the river of Egypt. And they take it to be the Wadi El Arish, which is there. But then again, my colleague David Noel Friedman, who always saw things better than everybody else, said, why? If you would walk up to anybody on earth and say, the river of Egypt, what would they think you're talking about? There, not that wadi, not that wadi. So, and as far as river Euphrates goes, there's no question, it names it, it's the Euphrates. And we will come later to a section where King David had conquered all the the surrounding countries and built an empire, which included, he had a garrison in Damascus, what is then and today the capital of Syria, which means basically he ruled everything up to the Euphrates. On the other side of the Euphrates, then you get Assyrians and Babylonians, and he never conquered them. But it's pictured that the Davidic Empire, I mean, that's presumably what's pictured in that promise that's given Abraham, is the Davidic Empire. And he did have ships down here at the top of the Red Sea. So he kind of did it, if the report of the Bible is correct. I mean, we don't know that, but we haven't found Hebrew inscriptions saying the house of David over here. We found them here, but not over there. So there's that. But then, right, there are also other boundaries given in Deuteronomy, and in Joshua it starts getting pretty specific. And I'll talk about from the Great Sea, and then over to here. And I'm not sure, are those just different authors with different conceptions, or the authors are writing in different periods where Israel, in fact, controlled different parts? Or, you could speak of America and say, from sea to shining sea. Right? Presumably that means Pacific to Atlantic, though they're not mentioned. Or you could say, that means, from the North Atlantic to the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, I'm fooling, but but there are different ways you could define America's boundaries. And from sea to shining sea does kind of leave out Alaska and Hawaii, which is a fairly high percentage of the territory of the United States. Leaves out Puerto Rico too. I like to be in America. So. There was a Broadway show. It was called Romeo and Juliet. Oh no, West Side Story. One so easily confuses the two. So we come to the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is the story of the arrival of these Israelites in the land. We know Joshua himself already, because right there at the end of Deuteronomy, there was the ceremony where Moses makes him his successor. You know him already in Exodus 17. He leads the battle, a fight against the Amalekites. Who are the Amalekites? They're descendants of a man named Amalek. Who is Amalek? Descendant of Esau, son of Esau. People always forget that. They're a subgroup. The Edomites are the descendants of Esau, and the Amalekites are some sort of subgroup or offshoot of that. Joshua, you knew in Exodus 25, he's up on Mount Sinai with Moses. He is therefore the only Israelite who's completely dissociated from the golden calf event. He's not there. In Exodus 33, it says that he's the tabernacle guard. Whenever Moses isn't in there communing with God, Joshua sits in the tabernacle, which is a very strange thing because Joshua is not a Levite priest, and therefore he should have been executed for sitting in the tabernacle. Lecture 19. And among the spies in the story in Numbers 13 and 14, Joshua and Caleb are the two out of the two good spies out of the 12 spies who are sent to look at the land. And remember, he's the faithful one. So he's already been set up to us in many ways as an important, good, positive figure. And he takes over from Moses, and it begins with God giving him a charge, encouraging him, and you'll notice in the first chapter of Joshua, referring to that scroll of the Torah. So it's still there, it's around. But it's not going to get mentioned again for a long time. The people say to Joshua, I love this part, they say, just as in everything in which we listen to Moses, so we will listen to you. That must have really given him a lot of positive vibes, There's the story of the entrance into the land. So what happened is, right, they started out in Egypt, and then they went, through or around or whatever the Red Sea, and then they got to Mount Sinai, wherever that is, on this side or this side of the Red Sea, and then they're out in the 40 years, and they came up here first. After a short time, but the spies thing happens, and they go back 40 years of wandering, and now they come up here, and they end up at the beginning of Joshua, right, at the end of the Torah, the end of Deuteronomy, the beginning of Joshua. They're here, just east of the Jordan River. That's where Moses could go up on a mountain and look across and see the land. And Joshua, being an old spy himself, sends in spies into the land. So he sends in these two guys, and they go to the first big city directly across the river, which is here, and that city is Jericho. And where does a spy go to get information? Just like in present movies. They go to a brothel, a house of prostitution. Now, I'm not going to tell any tasteless jokes about houses of prostitution, but there was this guy who used to go to the same one. He visited this house many times over the years, and one time he went, and the madam was like working with the rank and file, you know? And he said, you don't have to do this. Why are you doing this? And she says, I got fed up with administration. Now, you guys didn't appreciate that, but tell that joke sometime to a dean or president of a university. They'll love it. You know, tell it to a principal of your old go back and tell it to the principal of your high school. They'll love that joke. It's a tasteless, male, sexist, disgusting joke. I admit it. You'll get a good laugh, which is more important than truth and values and, you know, a good. Is it funny is the question. So they go to the house of this woman named Rahab, who is a prostitute in Jericho. And she gives them information, which is that all the people of Jericho have heard that there are, you know, these thousands and thousands of Israelites right across the river, and that they're coming, and they're terrified. And so they get this information from her, but then the king of Jericho, his people hear that there's a couple of strangers in town, so they surround her house, and she hides them upstairs in her house. And the way this works is, in we've got ancient gates and houses like this, so the way you built a wall around a city is you would do 2 or 3 layers to the wall. So there's the wall, and then there's an empty space, and then there's an inner wall. So if anybody breaks through, then they still have to face you at the second wall. But then they found that was a very convenient place to build houses, because you got 2 of your walls built already. So if you build one here and one here, you got a house. So that's where Rahab lives, in one of those. So then it says she lets them down out of the window. It's interesting, it's in a red cord. If you count how many times a red cord comes up in the Bible, it starts to get interesting. And she lets them out her window, which means now they're outside. So that's how they escape, thanks to her. And they swear an oath to her that she and her family will not be killed. And so they tell her, when the Israelites come and they attack the city, just take the red cord and hang it out the window, and we'll know that that's Rahab's house, and nobody will hurt you or your family inside the house. I always considered that a major plot mistake in the Bible. Because what's going to happen when the Israelites come? The most famous thing, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls come tumbling down. The walls all come tumbling down, and the Israelites go in. But her house is in the wall. And you go, well, maybe it was a miracle, like so her house doesn't fall down. And I go, then what the heck do they need the red cord for to show that it's the right house? She was the only house left on the block. I'm just pointing out that's the first one I've noticed so far in the text that appears to be a plot error. But maybe it's, you know, when the walls come tumbling down, it's not like everything gets leveled, or I don't know. So the Israelites get the message from the spies that they're terrified of these Israelites, and they start to come in, and there's this amazing event that happens, that the Israelites come, the priests carrying the ark, and the Jordan River splits. Not exactly split, it just stops flowing at one point. So all the water comes up to here and stops, and then from here it just dries up. And they march across. So remember this is our second water drying up story. It's not the last, or the second to the last. This happens from time to time. But it also sort of identifies Joshua as in the mold of Moses. Then he brings the people in, and he meets an angel, apparently. A guy who identifies himself as the captain of God's armies. Joshua completely destroys Jericho. And if you notice in Joshua 6, he puts a curse on anyone who would ever rebuild Jericho. He says if he does it, it will be at the cost of his firstborn that he'll lay its foundation. At the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates. And there's a fulfillment of that if you look in 1 Kings 16:34. So several books of the Bible later, 1 Kings 16:34, you'll see as a king who later rebuilt Jericho, and it says he did it at the cost of his firstborn and of his youngest. So the curse comes true in the story. Now, a ban is put on Jericho, which is, this is understood to be holy war. It is not for profit. So after the Israelites come in, they kill everybody. Men, women, children, animals. Everybody is killed. And they're not allowed to take any gold or silver, anything precious that they find there. That is to say, they all have to understand that this war is not being done for profit. No jokes. It's not being done for P-R-O-F-I-T. It might be done for P-R-O-P-H-E-T, which your spell check wouldn't get. And this is tremendously harsh, and they do this to some of the other cities as well. And so many people, understandably, have criticized the Bible for this and said it's genocidal. It's talking about, and people misuse the word genocide. Genocide normally means doing away with an entire ethnic group or entire race, an entire nation, something like that. But we are talking about the elimination of whole cities. And what can we say to deal with that? The first thing I can tell you is it never happened. It's not true. Now, until now, I've been very cautious about historical evaluation, pro or con, on various biblical stories. But I can only tell you that archaeologically, the stories in the book of Joshua of all these different cities around the country that they defeat and destroy, starting with Jericho, then with the city of Ai, spelled A-I. Some people pronounce it Ai is the name of the city. And then the confederation of 5 other Amorite cities after that, and all of that. Those sites have been excavated, and they have destruction layers. You can tell a destruction layer when you excavate a site. It's like gray. It's not brown anymore like the soil above or below it. There's a burn layer. And there are destruction layers. There is one at Jericho, except it's hundreds of years too far down. It's way earlier. It couldn't possibly be from the time of Jericho. By the time of Joshua. By the time of Joshua, whatever big destructions had happened in Israel had happened already. This just didn't happen. It's a story. And based on all the evidence known to me, with the one exception of one city here, up here in the northern half, the city of Chatzor. You'll see it written with a Z, or it's Chatzor, is how you say it. And there's really a destruction layer at the right time. Something really bad really happened to Chatzor in the 12th century, but not all the rest. Definitely not Jericho, definitely not Ai. So then you have to say, but if ancient Israel didn't do this, if they didn't commit this tremendous destruction, why would they pin it on themselves? Why would you put a book in your Bible and tell all these stories saying that you did these things if you didn't do them? And look, I think the answer is, we saw the earliest reference to Israel outside of the Bible, archaeologically, is from Pharaoh Merneptah's stela, where in the 13th century he says, Israel's seed is no more. And the second reference to Israel that we have outside of the Bible is from King Mesha, who we're going to read about later in the book of Kings. He was a Moabite king. And we've got this stela he erected. It's like sort of like this big and round, and it's in the Louvre Museum now in Paris. And he says, I defeated Israel, and their seed is no more. That's just what you said in those days. We murdered them. We killed them. We slayed them. Slew them. They're gone. We slaughtered them. You know. And so they speak of this destruction of the Canaanites, but that I'll show you the evidence. You won't just think so, but you know, it's just on my word. But it just never happened. And it's a terrible price has been paid for having this book in the Bible saying that it happened, because people are critical of Jews for that. People are critical of Israel for that. People are critical of the Bible for that. I mean, there's a lot came out of that. And if you want to see the actual evidence, we would go city by city and what the evidence is. The best sort of reader-accessible book, not super scholarly, but by a real scholar, is by William Dever, D-E-V-E-R. Bill Dever, he's still alive. He's one of America's two great biblical archaeologists, except he and the other one, Larry Stager at Harvard, have now both retired. So there's a new opening for America's greatest biblical archaeologist. And Dever has a book called Who Were the Early Israelites and Where Did They Come From? Here's another one called What Did the Biblical Authors Know and When Did They Know It? Which is playing off the wording of the Watergate hearings. And here's a third one called Did God Have a Wife? And about the goddess worship in ancient Israel. And Dever is a brilliant archaeologist. And in the book about who were the early Israelites, he just goes city by city and shows the evidence of the excavations on all of them in a way that you don't have to be a professional archaeologist to understand. But basically, hardly anybody, with a couple exceptions, hardly anybody in the field thinks that the conquest happened. Indeed, the second city they destroy, this city called Ai, the word Ai means a ruin. And it was called that because it was a ruin at the time. It was already gone. Then there's the story in Joshua 9 about the Gibeonite deception. Who are the Gibeonites? They were one of the Canaanite peoples. They were Jebusites and Girgashites and stalactites and all these different ites. And the Gibeonites are these people who see that everybody who goes up against Joshua keeps losing to him. So they pull this deception. They put on really old, worn clothes and shoes that are worn out. And they have those wine bottles, those leather wine, and water bottles and all. And they're like all dried out. And they come and they say, we're not from around here. We're from a very distant place. You wouldn't know where we're from. It's a very, very distant place. Nowhere in this neighborhood. Now remember, the Israelites have a commandment, to this ban to destroy everybody. So well, we're not from these parts here. We just came for the game, and so they say, well, let's make a covenant, a treaty with each other, a mutual non-aggression treaty. So Joshua makes this with them. He's swearing an oath to them that he will never destroy them, that the Israelites will never destroy the Gibeonites. Well, then it comes out that the Gibeonites are locals, and they're among the people that Israel's supposed to wipe out. Now he's got a little problem on his hands. He has made an oath in God's name. I swear to Yahweh that we won't hurt you. He has a direct command from God himself to hurt them. What do? Whenever there's a case that comes up in the Bible where you're caught between two situations, and either way you're going to have to violate something, if one of the two is the 10 Commandments, one of the 10, it outranks the others. One of the 10 Commandments is you can't take the name of Yahweh in vain. As I told you, that means if you swear an oath in God's name, you have to keep it. So Joshua actually has to keep that oath above a direct command from God because he made that promise. That's why Rahab gets to live. The spies promised her. And if you swear anything in Yahweh's name, then it doesn't matter what the rule is. That rule, by the way, is we use the Hebrew word cherem. The English translations never know what to do with this. I think most English translations use the word ban, B-A-N, putting something under the ban. I don't really like that. I think I call it the law of total destruction or something like that. Cherem means like holy war. Or that's not really fair. It is one of the rules of holy war, that you're not doing it for profit, you have to make total destruction. And so, for example, in Jericho, it says there's this man named Achan, and he takes some spoils. He sees some stuff in a house in Jericho, and he takes it and he hides it in his tent. And then the next battle they go to, this city of Ai, the Israelites at first are defeated. So they do this, what any of us would do under the circumstances. They hold a lottery to see whose fault it is. And the lottery, of course, falls on the guilty guy. We are in the Bible, after all. And the lottery falls on Achan, and he admits that he did it, and he shows them in his tent where he's got these gold and, treasures that he illegally took out of Jericho. And they stone him and his entire family. And you go, why the family? Because there's a rule elsewhere in the Bible that children cannot suffer for their parents' sins, and parents can't suffer for their children's sins. But that's an ethical law. Ritual law works differently. His tent contained this forbidden stuff that was sacred. It was supposed to belong to God. So anybody who was in that tent is now culpable. And they all die. So cherem is not something with which you mess. Now, next there's this confederation, it says, of 5 Amorite kings. Amorites, another term for people in the region. People argue, what is a Canaanite, what is an Amorite? But to understand, it's 5 of the cities located in there. The 5 kings realize no one can take on these Israelites. We'll take them all on together. So they have this confederation, but it says that Yahweh cast great stones from the sky. That's usually understood to be hailstones. That's in Joshua 10. And so the Israelites are defeating them, and they're getting away, and it's getting dark. And Joshua doesn't want them to get away in the dark. So he says to the sun and the moon, stand still in the heavens. And they do. And they get extra hours of sunshine so that they can catch these guys. And the text notes there was no day like that before it or after it that Yahweh listened to the voice of a man. It doesn't mean listened like heard. It means like listen when you say, now listen to me. Obey your mother. Do you hear? The old text may get hearkened, which captures it a little better. That is to say, Joshua has done something here that even Moses never did. He called his own miracle. And God rolls with it, and it happens. And it's not a minor miracle, the sun stopping in the sky. Well, for one thing, it means whoever wrote the story thought the sun goes around the earth, but let's be generous here. It means whatever your conception is of the universe, all the rules just got broken. Those of you who are physics majors, this is very difficult. If you're cosmology, this is a hard one. So look at the progression, though, because I was telling you to watch for 2 things. One was the various ways in which God makes himself known to humans, which we've seen change, like from the Garden of Eden to where we are now, and the different role that humans play relative to God and all this stuff. That humans don't do any miracles until maybe Jacob does that thing with the sheep and the goats coming out a certain color. Maybe. Joseph interprets dreams, which does appear to be a divine power. But then you got Moses and Aaron, and they can do all kinds of great stuff. And then Moses finally steps over the line where he changes a miracle. He's supposed to talk to a rock. He hits the rock. It shouldn't have worked, but it still works. And now Joshua even tops Moses. Nobody told him to say, make the sun stop. And if God hadn't gone along with this, then Joshua could have looked really stupid. Sun, stand still in the heavens. Stand still in the heavens. And that would have been very bad. So the text of Joshua ends with this destruction of the local people in a giant cherem, and the people arriving, conquest of the land.